So the New York Times has a piece today. It's called The Gaps Between White and Black America in Charts. And we're going to go through this in a second because the obvious implication is that the reason that these gaps exist and have continued to exist is because of continuing systemic racism in the United States. Now, there are after effects to history. I've said this before 1,000 times on the show. There are obviously after effects to history. If you bar somebody from buying a house in 1960, that will have some follow-on effect for not being able to give your house to your kids, for example. That is true. But there are certain gaps that certainly cannot be explained by history, and that includes the continuing wide income gap or the education gap or the single motherhood gap. That cannot be explained by history, particularly when you are looking at such a radical escalation in particular communities. To suggest that America is more racist now than it was in 1960, and when in 1960, the black single motherhood rate, by the way, single motherhood is the single greatest indicator of intergenerational poverty. When the black single motherhood rate in 1960 was 20%, and when today it is in excess of 70%, and in some heavily black communities, it's in excess of 90%. That cannot be blamed on racism. It cannot. There's just no way to do it, especially because the single motherhood rate has risen concomitantly in the white community, just not quite as fast. And you can't cite racism when you are saying, okay, I'm going to get a girl pregnant and walk out, which leads to poverty for your kid and for the woman you knocked up. If you decide to drop out of school, this is a personal decision that you cannot blame on racism or slavery. But the attempt to say that everything that is unequal in outcome is a remnant of slavery and Jim Crow is a dangerous but pervasive idea in today's modern America. We're going to get to that in just one second. Okay, so the implication of today's new take on racism, as we'll discuss, there's a fantastic author named Shelby Steele who has talked about the redefinition of racism. He suggests that we have changed the definition of racism from actual racial discrimination to what he calls globalized racism, the idea that all institutions of American life are shot through with racism. This is the way that the media cover all gaps, right? All inequality of outcome is obvious evidence of inequality of rights, which is obviously not true. That is obviously untrue. Kids within the same family have dramatically different income. Dramatically different income. I have 3 younger sisters. Our incomes are dramatically different across the spectrum. We grew up in exactly the same house. Okay, but the idea from the New York Times and from so many on the left is that if there's inequality of outcome, this evidences America's continuing legacy of racism. So, as I mentioned, there's this article in the New York Times that highlights some of the gaps between white and black America in charts. So they show the unemployment rate age 16 years or over, and they show that basically the gap in the unemployment rate between black and white has been fairly consistent since 1960. It actually spiked a bit. The gap seems to have spiked a bit during the 1980s, but it has gone back down now to probably its lowest point. If you look at this chart, it looks like the lowest point in American history. That gap was about 3% up until the pandemic hit, okay, which is a testament, frankly, to President Trump's economy. I mean, that obviously is a thing. But the unemployment rate, so the suggestion here is that if blacks are historically less employed than whites, even after the Civil Rights Act, and that the gap wasn't closed, then nothing must have changed. Or alternatively, a lot of things changed. Alternatively, there were Great Society programs that paid welfare. Alternatively, there were affirmative action programs designed to get people into college of minority races. Alternatively, there's a change in behavior as well. To simply look at the gap in the unemployment rate and then say racism, if all you knew was one factor, right, unemployment and racism, what you would suggest is racism hasn't changed, because this chart doesn't look like it changed all that much in terms of the gap. But obviously, many things changed, including the number of black Americans who are graduating from high school. The answer is 92%. Including the number of black Americans who are going to college. The answer is approximately 26% now? Go through a 4-year college? So that is a massive difference. Okay, it's a massive difference. By the way, again, there's this chart. It shows share of people 25 years and over who completed 4 years of college or more. And it shows that the gap between white and black has actually risen a little bit since 1960. Not that many people went to college in 1960, period, between white and black. But now, today, 36% of white Americans over 25 completed 4 years of college. 26% of black Americans have completed 4 years of college or more, which is an amazing, amazing statistic, right? Over a quarter of black Americans are completing 4 years of college or more. Now, what you would have to recognize also is that the black dropout rate is a lot higher in college than the white dropout rate in college. Black student college graduation rates remain significantly low. The nationwide college graduation rate for black students stands at 42%. So there are a lot of black students who are going into college and then are not graduating college. And by the way, it's largely, statistically speaking, black men are more likely to drop out of college than black women are. But that does explain part of the gap. So one of the things that has happened is, again, people refuse to look at ancillary factors that might explain continuing gaps. Because the idea is just a very simplistic single factor analysis. If there's a gap, that gap is due to continuing endemic racism. If you look at median household income, you see that there has been a continuing gap between white and black, and that the gap has actually risen in terms of median household income. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, why has the median household income gap risen, given the fact that racial discrimination in employment has been outlawed since the 1960s in both the private and the public sectors, right? In every state in the union. This is what the Civil Rights Act did. It's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, essentially. Why exactly is that gap still existent? Well, maybe it has something to do with high school dropout rates. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that so many public schools are failing black students, and so many black students are graduating from high school without actually having rudimentary skills and have to go into remedial education even if they go to college. I mean, there are significant gaps in the number of students by race who are going into remedial education once they hit college. Maybe this has to do with the fact that there are so many single moms, right? That changes the median household income. If the mom and dad are living together, the median household income, right? So mom and dad, their combined income is going to be higher. If more people are unmarried, that's two separate households now, right? So the household income is lower. In other words, what the New York Times is trying to do with all of this is imply that racism is still the deciding factor in American life. And in fact, they make this absolutely clear in the New York Times piece. They suggest that in many parts of the country, black and white Americans continue to live in very different worlds. This distinctive feature of American inequality is not an accidental development, but rather a result of policy choices. Again, the idea is that historic discrimination is what has caused all of this, which would not really explain why the black middle class was growing faster in the 1950s before the Civil Rights Act than it did after the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Another example, the home ownership rate. So the home ownership rate prior to 1990, right, going all the way back to about 1980, there's a huge gap between white home ownership and black home ownership. Well, as black income has risen, and it has risen dramatically from 1960 and on, wouldn't you expect more black home ownership? And yet black home ownership is actually at the lowest levels that it has been since 1990. So what exactly is going on here? You can't really blame redlining for lack of home ownership by black Americans in 2020 at this point. But what you can blame is rising real estate prices and low income, right? That's what you can blame. How about sentenced male prisoners per 100,000 residents of the corresponding group? So the idea here is that black Americans are being discriminated against in the criminal justice system. Okay, so the gap has actually dropped fairly dramatically from what it once was over the past 20 years. But for every 100,000 black males, 2,272 of them will end up sentenced to prison, as opposed to 392 for every 100,000 white males. Is that the result of racism, or is that the result of individuals making criminal decisions? The basic notion here that the New York Times is pushing, and this is the notion that the left is pushing, is that all inequality of outcome is due to discrimination, continuing discrimination in the system, which is not correct. It is not factually correct. When we look at the actual rationales for why income has remained low, or why, for example, young black men who are growing up in high-income households are significantly more likely to fall out of the top quintile than young black women, you have to determine whether there are individual decisions that are at play here. Right? You have to remove the confounds. But for the left, it's not necessary to remove the confounds, because the only thing that is important is implying that all of America's institutions are systemically racist, and therefore the onus is on restructuring those institutions so as to achieve equal outcome, not equal rights. And this view has infused so much of our public thinking right now. And what it does really is it makes white liberals responsible for, it's incredibly paternalistic. It makes white liberals responsible for the uplift of black Americans. Right? That's really what it is. It's a bunch of white liberals feeling good about themselves because, oh man, these systems are so bad. But you know what? I can fight racism because these poor black people, you know, I can't hold them to the decision not to have a child out of wedlock or to finish high school. But if I restructure the system, I can feel so good about myself, and it's really on me. It's really on me, the white liberal, to fix life for the individual black person. Even if the equal rights are guaranteed by the Constitution, by law, in every state in the United States, it's up to me to guarantee equal outcome. It makes people feel so good. And not only does it make people feel good, it leads to what Condoleezza Rice has correctly called the soft bigotry of low expectations. And this is how you end up with articles like this one from Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, professor of American history, in the New York Times, called "What Kind of Society Values Property Over Black Lives?" The idea being, she's professor of American history at UCLA, the basic idea being that we cannot expect, as Americans, black Americans not to riot and loot and burn things. Right? The idea being because all of the systems are so inherently corrupt that it causes black anger, and therefore it is wrong to expect black Americans not to riot and burn and loot things. Why? First of all, I think it's I think everyone should not riot and burn and loot. It turns out there are some white Americans doing that too. But you don't get to riot and loot and burn things because the supposition here is that all inequality, again, of outcome is the result of evils in the American system, and that people cannot therefore be expected to operate within the system. That operating within the system is itself a form of bowing to the system, and the system itself is inherently racist. And therefore, the truest form of fighting against the system is things like rioting and looting. This is the soft bigotry of low expectations Condoleezza Rice was talking about. We can't expect people to abide by the law because, after all, the law was originally founded in racism in 1619. And therefore, expecting people to abide by the law and live under the quote-unquote racist regime, that means that you are asking people to sacrifice their own honor to obey the law. It's absurd on its face. It does not make the lives of Black Americans better in any way, conceivably, like any way at all, because it turns out the path to prosperity in the United States is wide open if you make the right decisions. Only 2% of Americans who do the following three things: graduate high school, don't have a kid before you are married, and get a job, end up in permanent poverty in the United States, according to the Brookings Institute. You do those three things, you won't end up in permanent poverty. The soft bigotry of low expectations is one of the more dangerous things that is happening in the United States right now, and it's tearing the country apart. And it's largely being pressed by white liberals who want to feel good about themselves and establish their moral superiority to their fellow white person for acknowledging their own sin, and subtly to establish their own white supremacy by suggesting that Black people are incapable of taking care of themselves and need white saviors to come in and help them. Okay, this is an actual article in the New York Times by a professor of American history, Dr. Robin Kelly, at the New York Times. Why are they looting? It's asked every time protests against police violence erupt into civil unrest. We know the answers by now. Poverty, anger, age, rage, and a sense of helplessness. For some, it is a form of political violence. For others, destructive opportunism. There appears to be no single motive. That white youth figured prominently among looters during the recent wave of unrest confounds easy explanations. No, it actually doesn't. It actually doesn't. It turns out the vast majority of people who are looting have no interest in making a political statement. They are instead just stealing crap. That is true for white people. It is true for Black people. If you are getting a TV off the back of George Floyd, you're not doing anything for George Floyd. You're just a piece of crap. But we can't say that, right? We're not supposed to say that because apparently looting is a form of standing up to the system. This is the same mentality that led Maxine Waters to call the LA riots, which largely burned down Black neighborhoods in Los Angeles, the LA uprising. Uprising against what? Against the system itself, right? According to this columnist, let me offer a more productive question instead. What is the effect of obsessing over looting? It deflects from the core problem that brought people to the streets. The police keep killing us with impunity. Instead, once burning and looting start, the media often shifts to the futility of violence as a legitimate path to justice. Crime becomes the story. Riots, we are told, cause harm by foreclosing constructive solutions. But such rebellions have not only shined a spotlight on American racism, they've also spawned investigations and limited reforms when traditional appeals have failed. Okay, the evidence for this is extraordinarily limited. But again, this is all in pursuit of the myth that the greatest obstacle to Black success in the United States is white racism. And now the kind of bleeding edge of that is supposedly the police. And this is how you end up with the New York Times talking about the Rayshard Brooks shooting in Atlanta this way. Police decisions are scrutinized after Rayshard Brooks' fatal encounter. The original headline was, Rayshard Brooks' final hour was a jarring panorama of policing. Rayshard Brooks resisted arrest after a 25-minute conversation with police officers, wrestled 2 police officers to the ground, took a taser off a police officer, tried to tase 1 police officer, and then while running away tried to tase another police officer and was shot for his trouble. That is not a panorama of policing. That's a man acting like a criminal who was shot justifiably. And that's what a grand jury is going to find. The charges in this Atlanta case are absurd. But again, if the police are stand-ins for the evil system, then the police are the ones who have to answer for a man acting like a criminal. And we can't, of course, expect Rayshard Brooks not to act like a criminal, because to do so would be to engage in the fallacy that people are responsible for their own actions in the end in a free country. Now, none of this has any relationship to reality, right? In terms of the general idea that police are the greatest obstacle to Black freedom in America. It's just not correct. In fact, the officer in this particular case in Atlanta, he gave CPR to Rayshard Brooks. After he shot him, he gave CPR to him. Okay, but the narrative holds. And it combines with a narrative of white penitence, right? White penitence. And the white penitence is not designed to actually alleviate the problem. The white penitence is designed instead to do something else. And that is to reestablish the moral authority of white liberals. Right? Because the argument is that white people lost moral authority because of Jim Crow and racism and slavery, which is completely fair on issues of race. And the only way that the moral authority can be restored is if white people who are liberal express their guilt and then proceed to treat Black people paternalistically by offering a bunch of systemic changes, right? Being against the system becomes the marker of being a good person. And that's what white liberals are doing right now. Okay, so I want to read you from a fantastic book by the author Shelby Steele, who teaches over at Hoover Institute. And the book is called White Guilt. And it really does explain, I think, in detail, the worldview that ends with the belief that all inequality of outcome is an evil in America, and explains why we are seeing these acts of religious penitence from the left, from the white left particularly, and why we are seeing the attempt to rip away American history. I mean, there was a George Washington statue that got torn down in Portland yesterday. So I never do this, but I think that this is a very important subject, and I'm going to let somebody who is more well-versed on this than I speak to you here. So Shelby Steele, again, in his book, White Guilt, he talks about white guilt. He says, white guilt is, quote, the vacuum of moral authority that comes from simply knowing that one's race is associated with racism. Whites and American institutions must acknowledge historical racism to show themselves redeemed of it. But once they acknowledge it, they lose moral authority over everything having to do with race, equality, social justice, poverty, and so on. They step into a void of vulnerability. The authority they lose transfers to the victims of historical racism and becomes their great power in society. So in other words, when you acknowledge the guilt, the white guilt, that white supremacy was a governing force in the United States, you immediately lose all authority to speak on moral questions. Okay, because white guilt is a vacuum of moral authority, says Shelby Steele, it makes the moral authority of whites and the legitimacy of American institutions contingent on proving a negative, that they are not racist. Whites in American institutions are stigmatized as racist until they prove otherwise. White guilt leaves no room for moral choice. It does not depend on the goodwill or the genuine decency of people. It depends on their fear of stigmatization, their fear of being called a racist, right? Because if you are called a racist, you lose moral authority, and you are linked to a past that you don't belong to, but because you are a member of the white race, you are therefore guilty by association with the people who were creators of these institutions and did exist in a regime of white supremacy. You combine this with the new redefinition of racism. So it used to be that you were guilty for your own racist act, right? Or for your own racist feelings. That was the Martin Luther King version of racism he was trying to wipe from the human heart, and largely was successful in doing so. Then there is the broader version of racism. Okay, the broader version of racism is an essentially Marxist version of racism, says Shelby Steele. Ugly human prejudices like racism did not just remain isolated in the hearts of racists. These dark passions worked by an invisible hand to generate societal structures that impersonally oppressed. As people simply conformed to mundane standards of social decency, they executed a bigotry and shaped society around it without feeling animus toward minorities. The Marxian emphasis on structures and substructures gave the new militant leaders of the time, is the 60s, an infinitely larger racism to work with, a systemic and sociological racism that was far more determinative than the simpler immoral racism of the Martin Luther King era. So the Martin Luther King racism says that America would be free except for these obstacles, institutional obstacles of racism. Get rid of the institutional obstacles of racism, Jim Crow laws, racism in interactions, and we will now be free. And now the freedom is on us, right? Responsibility is on us. Once you suggest that it has infused all of the institutions, and the institutions themselves define human beings, the only way to change the system is to rip down the institutions. It is a very Marxist view of human life, that the institutions shaped you, that people did not shape the institutions, and that your fundamental decency within the context of an evil system does not change the evil system, right? You can say as much as you want, I'm not a racist, so long as you are part of an institutionally racist system. There is no getting away from the fact that simply by upholding the system, you are adhering to racism. As Shelby Steele says, globalized racism, this is the new definition of racism, is, quote, racism inflated into a deterministic, structural, and systemic power. Global racism seeks to make every racist event the tip of the iceberg, so that redress will be to the measure of the iceberg rather than to the measure of its tip, right? Because once you say that everything is infused with racism, all you have to do is point to a hotspot like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, and then say that this is the entire United States writ small, right? That's the tip of the iceberg. Now we have to attack the structures. It is a reconceptualization of racism designed to capture the fruit of the new and vast need in white America for moral authority in racial matters. And this is really the key, right? The basic idea here is that if white people are suffering from racial guilt because, as they should, they look to the history of the United States and are ashamed by white supremacy, that if that is the case, the way that white people, particularly white liberals, seek to reestablish moral authority is to prove that they are not racist. And the way to prove that they are not racist is by standing aside from the institutions that supposedly are shot through with racism. So dissociation becomes the key. Dissociation and labeling and cancel culture, these become a key. By the way, Shelby Steele was writing this in 2006. He says, suddenly, in American life, the matter of responsibility was qualified by a new social morality. If you were black and thus a victim of racial oppression, this new morality of social justice meant you could not be expected to carry the same responsibilities as others, right? In other words, because of social justice and the history of racial oppression, we can't expect you not to loot, right? That's the piece in the New York Times. The point was that American society no longer had the moral authority to enforce a single standard of responsibility for everyone because, by its own admission, it had not treated everyone the same. Thus, in the national consciousness after the 60s, individual responsibility became synonymous with injustice when applied to blacks. Thus, since the 60s, black leaders have made one overriding argument that blacks cannot achieve equality without white America taking responsibility for it. Okay, and this just suits white liberals to a T. The idea that equality can only be established if they are given the power to restructure American society, because it invests them again with moral authority, the moral authority they've lost because of white guilt. So now they have the power to restructure American society. And it's great. Not only do they get to show that they are better than other white people for having accepted white guilt, they also then get to restructure institutions without actually caring what happens to black people who are harmed by the restructuring of those institutions. This is why you see so many white upper crust liberals in Hollywood tweeting about defund the police when they won't be affected by defund the police one iota. This leads, as Shelby Steele says, to white blindness. A blindness to the human reality of minorities that occurs when whites look at racial issues, but see only the contingency they must meet to restore their own moral authority. In other words, what do I have to do to make myself feel better and make me feel like I'm on top of the moral pantheon again? White blindness is an unconscious self-absorption by which whites see racial issues and even interracial encounters as opportunities to dissociate from historic racism. Every time you interact with a black person, it's an opportunity for you to show that you are not a racist and therefore recapture your moral authority. And of course, you can't recapture your moral authority unless you rip the entire system, which, as we have said, is an indicator of globalized racism. Dissociation requires evidence of a proactive effort, a self-conscious and highly visible display. This is all Shelby Steele. And again, I'm reading to you at length here because I think that he expresses this so much more eloquently than I would. He says, people who are in the grip of white blindness and thus unaware of their true motivations always miss the human being inside the black skin. Your color represents you in the mind of such people. They will have built a large part of their moral identity and possibly their politics around how they respond to your color. Thus, a part of them, the moral part, is invested not in you, but in some idea of what your color means. And when they see you, the individual, you a black person, they instantly call to mind this investment and determine once again to honor it. They're very likely proud of the way they've learned to relate to your color, proud of the moral magnanimity it gives them an opportunity to express. So in meeting you, they actually meet only a well-rehearsed and better part of themselves. This is the sort of pretension that Jordan Peele mocks in Get Out. The people who are walking around with kente cloths and saying they voted for Obama twice. Says Shelby Steele, in the age of white guilt, white blindness has been driven not by racism, but by the white need to dissociate from racism. Whites are blind to blacks as human beings today, not out of bigotry, but out of their obsession with achieving the dissociation they need to restore their moral authority. And when they find a way to dissociate from racism, diversity, politically correct language, political liberalism itself, there's little incentive to understand blacks as human beings. Dissociation makes whites human again. Right? It gives whites the right to speak on these issues. The more you say that America is racist, the more you say your fellow citizens are racist, the more you say the systems are racist, the more moral authority you have. This is why you will see people kneeling. They're not kneeling to express actual penitence. They're kneeling to reestablish moral authority. Post-60s American liberalism, says Shelby Steele, preserves the old racist hierarchy of whites over blacks as virtue itself, and it grants all whites who identify with it a new superiority. In effect, it says you are morally superior to other whites and intellectually superior to blacks. The white liberal's reward is this feeling that because he is heir to the knowledge of the West, yet morally enlightened beyond the West's former bigotry, he is really a new man, a better man than the world has seen before. Because disassociation is a claim of superiority, it generates a kind of collective narcissism, an irrational yet utterly certain belief in the moral superiority of post-60s dissociational liberalism. Dissociational meaning you dissociate from all the institutions. You say, I'm not associated with it. I dissociate from those institutions and from a history of American racism. In this liberalism, one does not argue by logic or principle. One argues by dissociation. Only in dissociation are authority, legitimacy, and power available. When the American left responded to the crisis of white guilt and began to define social virtue as mere dissociation, it effectively started the culture war. Dissociation is always achieved at the expense of democratic principles and demanding values grounded in fairness and individual responsibility, what in shorthand might be called the culture of principle. It is important stuff because, as we're going to see, all of the sort of virtue signaling that you are seeing from the white left today is about dissociation. It is about an attempt to reestablish moral authority, and it is about control. It is not about healing the country. It is not about making the country a better place. Because if you actually want black Americans to be just as successful as white Americans and close all of those gaps, what you actually want is for people to make successful decisions on an individual level that lead to success. That is the thing you want more than anything in the world. What you want is not to incentivize behavior that leads to unsuccess or pretend that a few affirmative action stops are going to solve the problem of bad education in the black community overall by statistics. What you actually want are more opportunities, more freedoms, and more demands for individual responsibility. And Barack Obama tried this, and Barack Obama was shouted out of the room by a lot of people on the left when he suggested that individual responsibility was the first key to Black Americans rising in a free society. That, of course, is 100% true. And it's true for everyone, not just Black Americans. It's true for white Americans. It's true for Hispanic Americans. It's true for Asian Americans. If you want Americans to do well, you need to recommend that freedom be exercised responsibly. And that you white liberals, you are not responsible for your own savior complex, paternalistic, I'm going to restructure the systems so certain people are redressed of history's grievances. Okay, again, that's particularly true when you're talking about people who are 2 generations removed at this point from the Civil Rights Act and at least 5 generations removed from slavery. Now, you have to be talking instead about what are the actual factors behind these gaps, not what makes you feel good by creating some program that is likely to be unsuccessful. This is why you see people shouting about the police at the same time that what many members of the Black community, I would say the vast majority of Black Americans who are living in high crime areas need more than anything else is more policing. More policing. They need less crime in their neighborhoods. That's what leads to investment. That's what leads to people bringing their money in and their tax dollars that then go to the local schools. But instead, it's all about white people. I mean, so much of this really is about white guilt and white blindness. That's the real problem here.